Okay, good evening, everyone. It is 8 o'clock here Eastern time, so I'm hopeful that so many people are joining us. And if you are joining us right now, so excited and welcome. Very happy to have you. First off, just a huge kudos to all of you as well, because it is the end of your week. I imagine that I am the thing standing between you and your weekend. And I really appreciate you taking that time. I know that that's one of the biggest things that I want to make sure to shout out to all of you before we even get going here is just a great bit of effort on your end for just caring enough to take that time out of your Friday. So let's get right into it. My name is Kevin Coughlin. For those of you who may have met me a little bit on some of the Discords last week, I teach just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, at a small school founded by John Adams' cousin 100 years ago. And I'm excited to bring a lot of what we do here and what we've done in my class into this CRAM session, and hopefully it's something that builds on a lot of what your teachers are doing anyway. As a quick overview for what we're going to be doing over the next number of weeks, one of the biggest things that's different just about English in the first place and versus any of the other contents, as well as specifically the AP Lit exam versus any of the other APs for those of you who are cramming with us in other places. It is hard to check your work. It's hard to go back and look through the things that you do in so many of the other spaces that you can do it, especially your maths and your sciences, but especially even your histories where there are some facts to know. What we're going to be doing over the number of so many weeks here is really trying to look at as much material as possible, because the best way to study for all of this work is to look at as many different types of reading as possible, and to be able to look at that and talk through it in a way that helps us to really share ideas, that helps us to recognize a couple of different pieces in it, to look at the same piece of literature from a couple of different lenses. And so I definitely want to make sure that you are all taking a look, sharing with each other in the chat. I see that it's already really lively, and I appreciate that. I want to make sure that you're sharing some thoughts with each other. Anything that you're seeing in the excerpts that we're going to take a look at tonight, I encourage you to be talking about it with each other in that chat, as well as taking a look at some of the questions that we're going to look at as well, just as a group here. The other thing that I want to make sure that we recognize is that while we're taking a look, when you look at any of my slides or any of the streams that you expect from AP Lit coming up, when we see poetry listed, poetry is poetry. We're gonna look at any number of different types of poems from any number of different authors over the course of the next few weeks. But we also want to make sure that when we think about fiction, short or long fiction isn't necessarily going to be our biggest concern. It's going to be the things that we can work with in that fiction. So tonight in particular, we're going to think about a little bit about question 3. And so we're going to look at how we can talk about the type of literature that you might bring into a question 3. We're going to look at that from a couple of different passages. But at the same time, we're also going to, so we'll take a look at an actual question 3 at the end. But at the same time, we're going to examine that literature from the way in sort of the capacity that you might see it in question 2. I doubt that you would see a question 2 that uses the exact excerpts or the exact types of excerpts that we work with here. But we are going to be thinking about some of the skills, talking through some of the skills that you might want to use in either of those questions, as well as with your various multiple choice. you're going to see those, you're going to see excerpts, you're going to be asked to talk through those excerpts. So tonight in particular, you can see right from our little subheader here, we're going to be focusing on character and setting and thinking about how those things work together. So as we take a look here, we want to take a look. A few of those things that will be upcoming include our poetry next week. Looking forward to that. But again, as we're looking at our shorter and longer fiction, we'll be starting to get into, really, we want to think about the things that you all want and need, specifically in terms of the ways that you're trying to think through your studying, be it thesis questions about the multiple choice in particular. Though those are going to be real tips and tricks, and we're certainly happy to offer those things as well. But I definitely want to talk about, the more that we can practice with talking with the literature, the better off we're all going to be. So the biggest thing that I want to make sure is that we are sharing those things. Before we get into it tonight, and I appreciate how lively the chat is, I'm going to take a look at that in just a moment to catch up with you all. But I am interested, how are you all rolling into the weekend? Are you sitting here going, yeah, finally the weekend? Are you sitting here just kind of exhausted at the end of a long week? Is it kind of nothing special? Or do you have some big plans? I know, how many of us really have big plans right now, but that doesn't mean that you don't have, some get-togethers on Zoom or other places tonight. So I hope that you got something to look forward to this weekend, one way or another. Cool. Very good. Looks like everyone is finally and surely ready to get into the weekend. And so I hope that, that's something. Oh, I think I jumped ahead here. So I hope that that's something, that this is at least partially a good way to kick off your weekend, and your week. Let's take a look. A couple of things that we're going to look at particular. I know I mentioned character and setting. We're going to focus on a couple of different things that we can, a couple of different ways that we can talk about character in particular. I know setting might seem sort of obvious, and believe me, it absolutely is. You want to make sure that you obviously know the descriptions of the things that are going on around any given character in any given scene. Obviously, those things are important. You just want to make sure that we're acknowledging it. But more importantly, we want to acknowledge, how is the character reacting to that setting? So once we know who that character is, and once we start to get a sense of who these characters are, we want to make sure that how they play in different spaces and how they play well with other characters or not well with other characters, those are things that that are not by accident. Okay, the author is never making any mistakes. They know what they're doing, and they know that they're making the choices that they're making deliberately. And so it's our job to understand those choices and to recognize those choices, and even debate them, as we may see fit. And then finally, taking a look at how a character, especially with all of those variables involved, how a character is changing over the course of a full text. One way that I like to think about a lot of the work that we can do, and a lot of the work that we'll do over the course of our time with fiction, is thinking about how all of the different pieces, again, how all of those different pieces all of those different choices that an author makes, how they ultimately play into what makes a theme overall. And so it is important for you to be looking at these things, and I put together this little graphic here to be thinking about the fact that all of these things flow together: plot, statements of plot, characterization, the setting, and symbolism, how those things all filter into the various themes, or rather what you keep seeing. And then thinking about even the fact that Plot points can be symbolic, characters can be symbolic, the setting can certainly be symbolic. So seeing how all of those things, though I've kept them kind of apart here to think about how they sort of all pour into a theme together, I want us to remember always, and I really emphasize this to my students a lot. Nothing is in isolation. It is going to, all of these things are overlapping together pretty regularly. One place where I think that, this is even a conversation that I was having with my students this week. One concern that students have from time to time is truly understanding theme. And I know you've probably heard, so I've opened up a little bit of a poll here that probably has something said in regard to theme that you've seen in your class, or that you might think theme is. And really, I would argue that I probably use the word theme to mean all three of these, but I'm curious where you're at with how you might define an example of a theme. So there's a couple here. When we think about the question, what do you keep seeing? A character is constantly undone by traditions. The idea that traditions are dangerous, or in this case, dangerous. Sorry about that. Or just in general, that something that you might say, like, well, the theme of traditions as we see it in Things Fall Apart takes place so frequently. So I see here, and I'm actually really glad with this. I'm not going to say that any of these is right or wrong. I think if you were to talk about these in any sort of, if you just bring it up in your lit class, to suggest that traditions are dangerous, from a definition standpoint, I'd probably call that immoral. And I think a lot of people tend to use theme and moral, and in this case, I'm going to talk about we'll talk about motifs a little bit later on. I might actually go with that the character is constantly undone by tradition. The fact that things keep happening over and over again. To think about those traditions being dangerous is certainly one more piece of the puzzle that plays into the idea of an overarching theme. Now, that particular piece of it is not right or wrong. Again, like I said, all three of these, if you're talking about these, if you're using these, all three of these will come into play in some piece of your conversation, and how you use it is important. And I think that's the more important thing. What you ultimately say about any argument that you make is the most important thing to be thinking about with this work. And so we're going to talk about this sort of pattern as we go along here. Throughout the night. But tonight in particular, like I said, we're just going to focus on how these two pieces, character and setting, play together. Maybe they're interacting with each other. Maybe they're interacting with other spaces. Maybe people are coming in and out of them, or characters are interacting in one space versus another. But we're going to take a look at that all tonight. Let's start first with just a baseline of what it is that I like to think about when I'm thinking about character. I like to remember, and this is you can use this sort of a graphic organizer or this sort of an acronym however you want on a test, whatever way is helpful to you. In general, though, one of the things that I like to be thinking about is to be thinking about Tale's language when I'm talking about a character. So looking at asking yourself, what is the character thinking? How is the character acting? With whom is the character interacting, and what does and how can we talk about that interaction? What does the character look like, and what does the character say? One of the things that I want to really emphasize, though, is you're not going to get all of this at once. Maybe you will, but more often than not, it's just a way to remember the different things that you can think about to talk about a character physically, emotionally, or psychologically. Obviously, if a character is saying something, they aren't necessarily thinking it. Or more importantly, there are plenty of examples of a character who maybe is in a conversation, maybe they're interacting with somebody, and what they choose to think, they decide, I'm actually not going to say that. And so all of these different things, as you're going through, it might even be worth, especially if you get into, any bit of any question that's going to ask you about character, to jot down tales at the, in the margin of your essay or in the margin of your workbook, to think, okay, what am I looking for as I'm reading this passage? What can I remind myself to think about as I'm reading this passage? The next thing we want to think about is, with the setting, we want to find language that includes our senses. Okay, so anything that we see, hear, smell, touch, taste, etc. That sort of language plays into figurative language, and in particular, colors and imagery are naturally important. The way that a scene is described. Today with some students, we were reading an excerpt from The Handmaid's Tale, and we were thinking about the significance of a garden, a place where people plant things, nurture them, try to make them grow. Maybe we see the word or garden, and we think of things that are green and lush, but in this particular scene, redness and tulips were important. And so thinking about all the different details, but more importantly, thinking about who's in the garden at that moment. What is the garden? Is the garden lush, or is the garden sort of dry and barren? All of those things can be important as well. And we'll take a look at a little bit of that as well as we get into it here. What I'm going to try to do for you tonight is to work through a few different excerpts, first from some dystopia, and then in order to blend in some drama, we'll take a look at a few scenes in the play Fences. When it comes to for the first piece, though, I want to look at a couple of things that we can look at thematically similarly between Fahrenheit 451 and then In a Moment 1984. We'll look at two scenes, one from each, about how those places begin. We'll then go into a scene from the middle of it and a scene from the end. Obviously, when you think about how a character changes over the course of a full text, to think about the scope of that in a CRAM session here, we're not going to necessarily be able to talk about obviously the whole text, but we can look at a couple of pieces, sort of just bare bones, beginning, middle, and end. And so let's get right into that here. Take a look and feel free to read through this. If you're on a computer, I always recommend screenshotting. It looks like there's a couple of files that have been shared both on in the chat, as well as we took a look at some of the PDF files of this presentation on Discord this afternoon. So feel free to take a look. I'm just going to read through this a little bit. While we're reading through this, I'm going to open up just another poll here and think about some important lines that you may see as you're reading this. He hung up his black beetle-covered helmet and shined it. He hung his flame-proof jacket neatly. He showered luxuriously and then, whistling, hands in pocket, walked across the upper floor of the fire station and fell down the hole. At the last moment, when disaster seemed positive, he pulled his hands from his pockets and broke his fall, grasping the golden pole. He slid to a squeaking halt, the heels 1 inch from the concrete floor downstairs. He walked out of the fire station along the midnight street towards the subway, where the silent air-propelled train slid soundlessly down its lubricated flue in the earth and let him out with a great puff of warm air to the cream-tiled escalator rising to the suburb. Whistling, he let the escalator waft him into the still night air. He walked towards the corner, thinking little about nothing in particular. Before he reached the corner, however, he slowed, as if a wind had sprung up from nowhere, as if someone had called his name. The last few nights, he had the most uncertain feelings about the sidewalk just around the corner here, moving in the starlight towards his house. He had felt that a moment before his making the turn, someone had been there. The air had seemed charged with a special calm, as if someone had waited there quietly, and only a moment before he came, simply turned to a shadow and let him through. Perhaps his nose detected a faint perfume, perhaps the skin on the backs of his hands, on his face, the temperature rise at one spot where a person standing might raise the immediate atmosphere 10 degrees for an instant. There was no understanding it. Each time he made the turn, he saw only the white, unused buckling sidewalk with, perhaps, on one night, something vanished swiftly across the lawn before he could focus his eyes or speak. I appreciate you taking a look at our poll here. A couple of, that first line is one option. He hung up the beetle black colored helmet before he reached the corner, being the second. Whistling, he let the escalator waft him, being the third. And the air seemed charged with a special calm, being the fourth. Take another moment to think on these. I appreciate all the feedback in here. I appreciate all the thoughts in here. Let's take a moment. Really, the thing that I wanted to make the most of here is to see what stuck out to you the most. The most important line, especially when it comes to a line of prose, is completely a matter of opinion, obviously. But we want to be thinking about, if we're taking a look, let's think that let's pretend this is question 2 for a minute, and we're looking at a larger excerpt, and you have to pull out some evidence. What do you think you're pulling out? So taking a look here at what you have pulled out, let's talk through the one that you highlighted. The air seemed charged. The air seemed charged with a special calm. Really, if we're thinking through this scene once more, and I hope that you're reading it over again kind of as I'm talking through it, there's a couple of pieces here where there's a lot of words, and we're going to use the word conceit here, C-O-N-C-E-I-T, a bit of an extended metaphor, and it's not quite that, but you do see a lot of words that, in terms of setting the mood of this particular passage, have to do with wind or gusts. Like I said, I live just outside Boston, and I remember being a kid and walking down into the subway station, and actually out my window, I can even kind of see the lights of one of these trains driving by right now. Going down in the summer evenings, and obviously you get that heat, and you feel the rush of wind, that kind of exhausting wind pushing up on you as you're walking down the stairs and a train is leaving or coming into the station, and it just starts to sort of billow. That's exactly what is definitely happening here. Obviously, he's taking the train. He's talking about going in and out of the station. But there's other words here. This whistling, this constant use of air, the word waft. We see the word whistling a couple of times, actually. He slowed as if a wind. And then there's this feeling that someone is there, and there's a shadow. There's someone who turns into a shadow and lets him through. There's a lot that we can say here about setting. Okay, there's also a lot about his movement. We're actually in a couple of different places now. So the setting in this particular passage isn't a place, but a number of places. And so as he moves from one to the other, the setting is maybe a moment. The setting is his evening as he's walking away. And our character here is Guy Montag. And for those of you familiar, even just with the premise of Fahrenheit 451, he is a firefighter, but a firefighter who notoriously burns books. And so we get this sense of a summer evening. We get this sense of of something that should be a little bit celebratory. He's getting off work. It's not probably much the way that we all felt just sort of at the start of tonight's session. He's getting off, and he's just sort of whistling on his way home at the end of a long day, and that's excellent. So we can say about him, not a ton. Okay, we get a sense of that he is a casual person. but more in the way that he interacts with the setting around him, rather than the way that he, rather than anything that we're really told about him. By the same token, though, there's a bit of a paranoia that comes up in him here. He's talking about interacting with the space around him. But that space is one that is suddenly absent. There's one, again, that word shadow. I love the word shadow. I can't tell you, like, any time that we would see the word shadow maybe pop up in a piece of literature and not have it be important. And obviously, as we get into this idea, again, the idea of wafting and still night air, that the word shadow should stick out to us as well. And then we get, even a faint perfume is going to be something that is on the wind, right? So there's some airiness to that as well. The word atmosphere, there's some importance to that as well. The air, the air seemed charged with a special calm. It is something celebratory. And so as we go from this beginning piece, this beginning of this text, or of this excerpt rather, excuse me, as we get to the beginning of this and we're looking at it and we say, okay, there's a handful of things. Here's this person who's getting off work and he's excited. And then by the end, he feels a little confused. He feels a little suspicious of something. He feels a little suspect. He feels some level of unease. And even this idea that he struggles to focus his eyes and struggles to speak. That's something that differently engages the mood that we get from that character. Again, we want to think about this in comparison to a couple of different different openings to text. In this case, we're going to bounce back and forth between two different dystopias. So again, I'll take a look here, and we've looked again. So that for that first scene, we looked a little bit at the setting. Here, I want to look a little bit at the. I'm actually here. Let me hide that for a second while we take a look at the scene first, and then I'll open it up for you. Looking at one of the opening scenes of 1984, as we have Winston Smith walking into a hallway that smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked on the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man about 45, with a heavy black mustache, ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the elevator. Even in the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours and was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of the colored pictures which are so contrived the eyes follow you when you move. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, a telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, a meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades and the cold of the winter that had just ended. So take a moment here. There's a lot in this passage. And again, not necessarily a passage that we'd be thinking about in terms of definitely seeing on on question 2, but maybe it's something that we might see in a multiple choice passage. Regardless, we want to practice with the skill of being able to pull some characterization from this passage, pull some setting from this passage. But we already looked at some setting here, so keep that in mind. Think about the character. What do we know from this? What piece of evidence helps us to build that character? So as we take a look here, I'm noticing a couple of our pretty overwhelmingly, there's a lot of characteristics that are shared with us. And so if we're thinking back to that Tales language, which you all just noted here, if we're thinking back to that Tales language, what does he look like? Well, his hair is fair. Excuse me. And he is someone who is also a little frail and meager. So you've pointed to a number of those things that we would definitely pull out with our Tales language. You'll note again that I didn't point to any one of these as particularly right. Obviously, again, we started from the jump here looking at emphasizing that Tales acronym, and what you've pulled here, exactly right. But I would also say here, that line about the flat being 7 flights up is important as well, okay? Neither one is right or wrong. Both are important. We want to have a picture of him. The fact that he's frail and meager as well is important. There's any number of things we can say about that. Let's think though too about setting and character together, which I realize again, not the question I asked. I asked for character and character alone. But let's think about both here. If we're thinking about the setting, then the fact that he's got to walk up all of these stairs, for any of us in general, I think, depending on how far up we had to go, we'd probably choose the elevator. I remember, being when I was in college, I had a job on the 5th floor of a building, and usually I'd try to challenge myself to take the stairs and really, be conscious and do good by that. And usually I'd end up just taking them down the stairs instead of actually going all the way up the stairs. Usually I'd go for the elevator. But I can tell you something, that's 7 flights up. We are probably taking the elevator, but he doesn't have that option. So he's taking the stairs 7 flights up. But he's also, you're all certainly young and spry. I'd like to consider myself young and spry, but probably not. But I won't say, I'm not 39 and I don't have a varicose ulcer above my ankle. He does. And so walking up 7 flights of stairs is not only difficult, it's extra difficult. That varicose ulcer we're going to find important. And I point that out because I've thought about it as we've gone through a couple of the other pieces that we're going to take a look at tonight. That varicose ulcer bothers him, and it bothers him a lot pretty regularly throughout the text. So if we're going to notice something like that, and we're going to notice that it's something that would bother him, and more importantly, you may be familiar with what a varicose ulcer is. It's sort of something that's a little bit more protruding on the leg. More importantly, it is an odd detail. Okay, again, very important to know what he looks like overall. But a distinguishing feature is this varicose ulcer. And the fact that it hurts him means that we also sort of want to ask, well, okay, here's this weird detail. What else is going on? Part of it is that the electricity is out during the daytime hours in his apartment. Part of it is that there is this giant poster in the hallway. And obviously, again, even if you haven't read 1984, I'd like to think that you're familiar even with just the concept of Big Brother. And so we see this description, and as he's staring, or as he's under the watchful eyes of this poster, his ulcer is acting up. And so we see a lot of different descriptors here, all of them important. But we see how the character is revealing something to us in the way of the ulcer that is also juxtaposed to the other important defining characteristics of the apartment building itself. And so we get a sense of sort of something much darker and drearier. And not only is it dark and dreary, but it also is happening while he's already hurting. And so it just doubles down both that character trait and that physical trait and a descriptor of the apartment. Let's jump in here and we'll jump back to Fahrenheit 451 for a second. One of the things that I want to think about as we're working through Fahrenheit 451 is starting to get into that idea of interactions, how characters are interacting either with each other or with the environment around them. So we're building on this a little bit. That first slide, we saw something to say about some setting. That second slide, we saw a lot of different character traits listed to us that we were also able to tie into the setting. Now we're going to add some new characters to the mix, okay? There's going to be a whole host of house guests who are, again, we're pulling this out of the middle of the text here. So taking a look at these house guests. When do you suppose the war will start? He said. I notice your husbands aren't here tonight. Oh, they come and go, said Mrs. Phelps. In and out again, Finnegan. The army called Pete yesterday. He'll be back next week. The army said so. Quick war. 48 hours, they said. Everyone home. That's what the army said. Quick war. Pete was called yesterday, and they said he'd be back next week. Quick. The three women fidgeted and looked nervously at the mud-covered walls. I'm not worried, said Mrs. Phelps. I'll let Pete do the worrying, she giggled. I'll let old Pete do all the worrying, not me. I'm not worried. Yes, Millie said. Let's let Pete do the worrying. So let's take a minute as we read through. We'll read through this second larger chunk here. But in a moment, let's think for a second. How do we describe this dialogue right at the beginning? What do we learn about these particular characters from this dialogue? Take a moment there while we look at the bottom piece. Montag had said nothing but stood looking at the women's faces, as he had once looked at the faces of saints in a strange church he had entered when he was a child. The faces of those enameled creatures meant nothing to him, though he talked to them and stood in the church for a long time, trying to be of that religion, trying to know what that religion was, trying to get enough out of the raw incense and special dust of that place into his lungs, and thus into his blood, to feel touched and concerned by the meeting of the colorful men and women, and the porcelain eyes and the blood-ruby lips, but there was nothing. It was a stroll through another store, and his currency strange and unusable there, and his passion cold, even when he touched the wood and the plaster and the clay. So it was now, in his own parlor, with these women twisting in their chairs under his gaze, lighting cigarettes, blowing smoke, touching their sun-fired hair, and examining their blazing fingernails as if they had caught fire from his look. Their faces grew haunted with silence, and they leaned forward at the sound of Montag's swallowing his final bite of food. They listened to his feverish breathing. The three emptied walls of his room were like the pale brows of sleeping giants now, empty of dreams. Montag felt that if you touched these three staring brows, you would feel a fine salt sweat on your fingertips. The perspiration gathered with the silence and subaudible trembling around and about in the women who were burning with tension. Any moment, they might hiss a long, sputtering hiss and explode. There's a bit here, and I might add in here, I would likely think through vapid as the thing that I would want to point out the most here. They're really dismissive, and vapid is part of that. Vapid being, vapid being that they are unconcerned with important things. The war, think about, God forbid if we know anyone who has had to go off to war. They're off for a bit. This is, they called up Pete yesterday. He's going to be back next week, like he's going on a business trip. And they're not particularly worried at all. They're pretty dismissive of what's going on here. And so to hear them sort of kind of chattering back and forth, there is a worry. There's a sense of worry there. I understand why a lot of people did pick that idea of worry. But there is a tension. And so I think for those who said worried, I recognize that there is a tension that is named in the bottom portion of this text here. For those who said awkward, this is an awkward scene, and I think that that's important as well. Take a look at, just for a moment, take a look at all of these words just for a second. I'll pull these back up for a moment. Worried, vapid, awkward, and compassionate. I might suggest that vapid is probably the most kind of unique word that you may have seen, but I suspect that you've all heard the word vapid. I suspect that you've all heard all of these words before. What's important, a point that I want to make here, is that when you're talking about characterization on your exam, characterization, words for any word at all that you use can be strong without being a huge word. To describe a character as compassionate even is a long word, but it's not a big word, right? It's a word that you've probably used before. Something worrisome is a word that you've probably used before. Something awkward, okay, is a word that you've probably used before. And if you added vapid here tonight, fantastic. Vapid is also something that's really self-involved, and while that's happening here, I don't think that it's necessarily the word. I don't think that self-involvement is necessarily the thing that makes this scene as awkward. It's more the ambivalence, the lack of caring about the fact that one of their husbands was just pulled off to war. That understandably would be a very trying emotion, but here they are. Well, he'll be back next week. He's just going away for the week. It's not a big deal. So the fact that they're dismissive about it is what makes them unworried. The fact that we feel this tension, though, is something that we should gather. There's a lot, again, going on in this passage. When we think through it, we notice a few things. One, we can point to, if we're thinking about Tale's language, we can point to the interactions, both the interactions that we're watching between the various house guests and the interactions that we're watching in, again, Guy Montag is watching these guests talk. He asks this initial question, this war starting, but then he doesn't particularly interact with them anymore in the excerpt that we're looking at. He does blow up a little bit later on in this scene and makes the whole thing very awkward, but that's not what's happening here. That's one thing, just as an aside, that I'll emphasize to you as a bit of a test-taking strategy. Remember that you might love Fahrenheit 451. You might have, as a younger kid, found it as a graphic novel in your middle school library and really liked it. And then you got up to maybe your junior year and you read it for class, and you talked through it, and maybe you've you've seen some adaptations. Maybe you're a fan of Ray Bradbury, who played with this back and forth as a teleplay and as a stage play and as a novel. You might know everything there is to know about Fahrenheit 451. That does not matter. You want to make sure when you have an excerpt in front of you that you're focused on what is in front of you, because that's what the test is asking for. If you have all of that knowledge, really see if you can't put it to use on question 3. That's awesome. You should always go in with those books ready to go. But in terms of looking at excerpts, knowing that the right answer is right in front of you, it should be a really confidence-inspiring moment for you, because you're just being asked to talk about the excerpt in front of you. And so as we take a look here, I want to make sure that we're going through this passage, which is particularly meaty, to gain some of those skills. Looking at these interactions, let's focus on just the interactions with the women together. We talked about them being vapid and dismissive. Let's think back to the setting for a moment. Not only are they in Montag's living room, but very little attention for this excerpt is paid to the living room itself, or the word here we see is parlor. Instead, the description of the setting is that of this old church that Montag once visited. And again, we see you could argue this is a conceit. It is just this extended illustration of the church being this place that we start to look at about with language that is related to fire. So the same way that we looked at those warm bursts of wind in the first passage, here now we're looking at a lot of language both related to church and related to fire. So to touch and concerned by colorful men and women with porcelain eyes and blood ruby lips, again, the redness of fire. We see the opposite of fire with his passion, cold. We see wood and plaster and clay, things that might be used in constructing a fire pit. We see just kind of lighting cigarettes, blowing smoke, touching their sun-fired hair, their blazing fingernails, and caught fire from his look. Okay, I think you get the idea. With that there, one of the things that we can recognize is that it is both fire language and a fiery description, something that is becoming more and more and more intense with each passing description. So he's looking at these people. He seemingly doesn't feel connected to them. Okay. He asks this question. He seems, even though it's kind of just small talk, when do you suppose the war will start? It's not dismissive. He asks an active leading question and they respond dismissively. So he's not really in sync with them in this moment anyway. And so to think about this room and to think about the fact that it starts, to look at the penultimate line here, the perspiration gathered with the silence and the sub-audible trembling around and about, and in the women who were burning with tension. And so there is this feeling that they're ready to turn around and hiss and explode, kind of like a furnace, again, to extend that fire language. They are ready to burst out at him. Let's take a moment. I am conscious of the time with all of you, and I want to make sure that we have a minute to get into our exam, to talk through the example question 3 that we can be thinking about here. I want to look at George Orwell in 1984 again. to skim through this a little bit, if we look at the first just the top piece of this excerpt here, we see a lot of different descriptors, just like we saw in that first excerpt. During the month of June, Winston had dropped his habit of drinking gin at all hours. He seemed to have lost the need for it. He had grown fatter. His varicose ulcer had subsided, leaving only a brown stain on the skin of his ankle. His fits of coughing early in the morning had stopped. His health, not that we knew his health to be poor, from the excerpt before, but we did know that he was someone who had to climb a lot of stairs. He was old, and his varicose ulcer acted up. We can assume that there was a lot that he may have had a number of other health problems. He didn't particularly seem like a healthy individual, but we wouldn't hold it against him for having to walk up all those stairs. Here, though, he is much better. He is pretty healthy and spry. And as we take a look, he's met this woman, Julia, and he feels better. He's been given a new lease on life. And so as we're thinking through that, again, they're meeting in this hideout of a room above an office owned by a Mr. Charrington. And so to look at this again, let's take a look at some of the language that we see. Now that they had a secure hiding space almost at home, it did not even seem that, it did not even seem that a hardship that they could only meet infrequently and for a couple of hours at a time. What matters that the room was over a junk shop should exist. To know it was there, inviolate, was almost the same as being in it. The room was a world, a pocket of the past where extinct animals could walk. Mr. Charrington, thought Winston, was another extinct animal. He usually stopped to talk with Charrington for a few minutes on his way upstairs. The old man seemed seldom or never to go out of doors, and on the other hand, to have almost no customers. He led a ghost-like existence between the tiny dark shop and the even tinier back kitchen, where he prepared his meals, and which contained, among other things, an unbelievably ancient gramophone with an enormous horn. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause there as we continue working through, just to think about all of those. Pieces. Which line best contributes to the mood of the room? Take a minute and think there. Which best contributes to the mood of the room? We can take a look at all of these and think through them. I think it's important, again, all of these, especially me in particular, I have an affinity for looking at all answers as being in some way right. So first off, remember the word what best fits. And also, I would argue that anything that you do see as these options, all of these lines are going to be meaningful. It may not, there may be a best fit answer for this question, but you should take a minute to look at all of those lines and think of them as meaningful. So think through that for a moment. And good. I think here we are. A number of you all said, or a number of you pointed to that ghost-like existence. A little bit of a hint there from that word ghost-like, as we've seen it a number of times already this evening, that word ghost-like. But let's take a look at that in particular. Realize that the question, again, is contributes to the mood of the room. When we think about how character and setting relate, though, that's something that would be important about the description of the room versus the want to make faces. There's also something that I want to point out about the third option. Mr. Charrington, thought Winston. Mr. Charrington thought Winston was another extinct animal. I love lines like that because they point to what's called an anachronism. An anachronism, break it down, ana means not, chron means time, and ism is obviously state of being. So something that is not in place with that time, something that is out of place in a time. So, you know, if I'm sitting here, you know, if I were sitting here talking to you while I'm texting on my flip phone, that flip phone is anachronistic. It's not really, it doesn't really fit within, within some of the things that you might see in this time. It's something that maybe I had often, and all my friends had when I was taking my AP test so many years ago. But so many people have various smartphones now. That's more in line with the time. Though I do want for my old flip phone, and so that's something that I like to point out is that time. So as we think through this space, there is something still sort of out of place and ghost-like, but by the same token, Winston, that its effect on him. Okay, so we'll go away from I'll go away from the poll here. We'll think the question may be what's the mood of the room, but its effect on him is really important too. That if we're thinking about how he's interacting with the room and interacting with the girl that he meets, Julia, to know that that interaction actually improves his spirits and improves his space. We can be thinking about that. I want to take a minute here, and I apologize for all the skipping ahead that I'm going to do. I hope that it's been helpful to go through and sort of go into these various lines and pick out important pieces of text with you tonight. But I would be remiss if we didn't take a look at question 3. So since we're up against it, I want to do that for a moment. So pardon me, I definitely want to get into fences. I want to spend some time on drama, and since we missed that a little bit tonight, I will for sure, in one of our next fiction units, focus intently on drama. So please, I would encourage you to come back for that. When we meet again. I believe that date is the 20th of March. So I look forward to seeing you all again. And please remember that tomorrow we're going to be launching some of our trivia series. The first of our lit trivia will begin at 5 o'clock. So take a look for that. As we finish up the evening, however, let's take a look at this practice question from the AP in 2005. In The Awakening, the protagonist Edna Pontellier is said to possess, quote, the outward existence which conforms and the inward life which questions. Now, 1984 is one of the options that comes up on this piece, but you can use, but really any dystopia is going to fit this really easily, because typically, as we've seen in both of our pieces tonight, there are people who, the way that we might characterize them is in contrast to the environment that they're in. And so if we look at this question, or we look at this statement here, that outward existence which conforms, and that inward life which questions. If we think about Guy Montag, who was in the middle of that living room, he's burning up inside while everyone else around him is really dismissive of even a war. If we think about Winston Smith, he's someone whose body is physically aching. This ulcer is physically hurting him when he's forced to just conform to the drab life around him, when he's underneath this giant poster with eyes looking at him. But when he's able to sneak away from that and make a life for himself and steal some moments with a companion, that ulcer goes away, his skin clears up, and things are much, much better. Let's take a look at the question, though, in particular. You want to write an essay in which you analyze how the tension between outward conformity and inward questioning contributes to the meaning of the work. And you want to avoid mere plot summary. One of the words that I love about this, and again, it's another one that we've seen tonight, is that word, that word tension. I love that word tension because it is two things that are pulling in opposite directions. But it also just means conflict, right? How is that conflict between inward and outward meaningful. Do me a favor and briefly in the chat, if you would, here, I would love for you to add what is a text that you think would best answer that. What's a text that you know that you think would best answer this question, and who's a character in there? As I'm taking a look just quickly, I see what's the function of an anachronism in the Q&A section, and I appreciate you using that area. While you're thinking through that chat piece, I'll go through that. An anachronism can work in a number of different ways. An anachronism often is a way to talk about a character. So you can think about a character who doesn't fit in a space, and talk about why they don't fit in a space. It can also be like, for example, a telephone that is maybe out of place, or someone using a typewriter when everyone else has computers. And that person, we can sort of define them as a bit old-fashioned. We can recognize that they're out of place. And more importantly, one of the things that we want to note the most is that they tend to contrast with the setting or the people around them. Since that's the case, it lends itself to something that you could talk about in regard to a question like this. And more importantly, at the risk of ending our night on a drab note, anachronisms tend to die at the end of our texts. When we see any character who dies, I think about a Gatsby, for example. He's not quite out of place in the time, but he is out of place in the society. And so he could be a character who doesn't necessarily fit. And so even a metaphorical death, so a character who doesn't quite die, but something is stripped away from them, that thing that is stripped away tends to resemble something that doesn't belong, and we may want it to belong. We may desperately want it to belong. We may be crushed that it's stripped away. But in terms of the society and the setting and the way that the character and the setting interact, which again, just to bring that all back together, the way that those things come together, some really great examples in here. The way that those things come together is how our characters are affected by the setting around them, and sometimes that's in really negative ways. So just a few things to remember here as we wrap up at the end. Character. What is the character? Who is the character? What do they do? What do we know about them, and what are they trying to take from the scene in any given moment? When we're thinking about the setting, we want to think about any sort of descriptors that help to put us there, but more importantly, we want to think about what is the character feeling in that space. If we're trying to lend ourselves to that character, we want to use Tales language, and I always want to give you the confidence that sophisticated language does not necessarily mean big words. They're words that you use every day. They just want to be things that are described really well. I really hope, I'm sorry that we ran up against the time here tonight, but I hope this was helpful. I really hope that you keep this conversation going on in Discord. And I appreciate all the time that you've given us and given each other in the chat tonight. I hope you have a very, very safe weekend. I hope it's productive. I hope it's restful. And thank you. And I hope that you'll join us again tomorrow for the lit trivia. All of that is to say, thank you and have a good night.